All right. When we're talking about training zones and what kind of parameters are we looking at as far as connecting everybody to the training load that we're prescribing? For example, you may have a coach or a plan where you're going to be doing different types of focuses in the training on different days or even on the same day. And so we need to be on the same page. What kind of a training stimulus does the plan call for, and how do you know you're on that right track as far as the intensity goes in your training? So we've talked in previous videos about how we look at heart rate, and we can look at power output and define those based off of some form of a test, and then we can give you these ranges and parameters to follow so that you're complying with the program. Another really important parameter is the rating of perceived exertion. So some of you may have gone through my testing or some form of testing on the treadmill or the bike, and you saw some kind of a form that probably looked like this. It's a 0 to 10 RPE scale, so-called. RPE stands for rating of perceived exertion. So this is another way to identify if what you're doing complies or is correctly put into the category that we're trying to give you a stimulus for. So sometimes the heart rate, or quite often, it may not necessarily jive with this perceived effort, and we need to be able to analyze that and make sure that we're doing what we need to be doing for the plan. So especially when we get up into the upper zones, zone 4 and above, or RPE 4 and above, or the zone 3 and above, we'll get into that in a second here, then really the RPE scale becomes more important, because heart rate's not going to necessarily respond according to what we want to have the stimulus be. So if we go back to the training zones, you can see here we've talked about these zones. Usually we're looking at, again, 5 zones, and the 5th zone is usually that high intensity interval training, so we can break that down into a couple more zones so we can get specific on the type of intervals. And we can also make some determination of how that should feel. What's the perceived effort to the individual who's training? So you can see zone 1, we're looking at an RPE on that 10-point scale of 1 to 2. So there's really 0 would be no exertion at all. So if we go back to the scale, nothing at all. If we get up to 0.5 to 1, we're talking about very, very easy. Feels like, if we're at 1, like a leisurely walk. And then when we hit zone 2, it's still easy, but there's a little more effort. You can still easily maintain a conversation, but you may notice the breathing a little bit more. And then you're comfortable in zone 3, but it's starting to feel like a little bit more effort. Breathing becomes a little bit faster. And then you get into zone 4. It's now you're working hard, but you can still maintain a pace without too much discomfort. Theoretically, this correlates with zone 5, so somewhat hard, too hard, or even getting close to the very hard, depending on how long you're at the load. That correlates with zone 4. So you can see we just get progressively harder until we're getting close to that maximal effort. When we get into this 4 to 7 range, we're usually really not able to carry on a conversation for very long, and it's really takes some focus and concentration to keep that load up. So perceived effort is a way that we can kind of make sure that what we're trying to do in the workout, especially in the upper zones, is in compliance with what the coach or the training plan is recommending. If you go into my Substack, you can go into some descriptions on the different zones. Just look under the zone category, and then you'll see a box that looks like this. So I'm going to use a couple examples here. If we're looking at zone 2 training, so that's your fat burning zone or the aerobic specific oxidative type zone. It's really important for health, and especially for the endurance population. We want to, if you're spending a lot of time training, then you're probably going to need to spend a lot of time in zone 2 as far as the percentage of time. So this will explain a little bit about what zone 2 is all about, but if you go down to the RPE scale, it's going to be that, easy to moderate level. So that RPE of 2 to 3. And then the heart rates are going to be pretty consistent here, so you can usually use the heart rate as the zone indicator so that you know that you're at the right intensity. But as soon as you start going up into the upper zones, for example, if we click a little further in here, go to zone 3, and then into zone 4. For example, now we're typically doing some kind of interval. You're definitely pushing the intensity now, so we got a range here. For example, if you're doing zone 4 lactate threshold intervals, it's going to be an intensity that you theoretically could go 50 to 60 minutes at it if you had pit bull chasing you. But it's going to be maximal effort for that 50 to 60 minutes. So when you're doing intervals here, you're going to be usually doing 5 to 10 minute long intervals with shorter recoveries. So the first interval may feel like a 5 on the RPE scale, but by especially the longer intervals later into the workout, you're going to feel like you have very hard level. So again, we're trying to provide a stimulus to give a certain adaptation to your training, and RPE, the scale, will often be used just to complement what we're trying to give you on the heart rate and the power outputs. Again, especially on the upper intensities. So when we're doing some form of interval training, even the long intervals, you really need to be paying attention to the RPE scale. Sometimes we're not going to get to the heart rate, or it's going to exceed the heart rate, but the stimulus still needs to be in that level. So again, we're looking at things like power in addition to RPE to define what these loads are in the upper zones. So in a nutshell, RPEs are a really important part of your training prescription or following the plan. And especially you'll notice if you're on the coaching program, some of these interval sessions we may rely on RPE if we don't know the power outputs or the paces necessarily. But you're always going to be factoring in how it should feel. If you're doing VO2 max intervals, it's going to be up around 9-10 on that RPE scale. So very important to know how to use that so that everybody's on the same page with your training.